Hello. Oh, thank you for coming. Welcome to the social. My name is Lee Brackstone. I'm the publisher of White Rabbit. Guys, you can come up here. Yeah, come up here. As you probably already gathered, I mean, you're here so you know what's going on, but from the soundtrack, the Scottish post-punk, pop, underground, 1977, 1984. It's a book White Rabbit published a year ago in hardback, Hungry Beat. So I'm pleased to welcome one of the authors, Douglas MacIntyre.
Thank you.
Ben Thompson, you can clap by the way. Yeah. Bring the noise! Esteemed ghostwriter, critic, journalist, Ben Thompson, who's working on a book that I think there's gonna be a bit of a reveal.
A soft announce.
Yeah, soft announce, yeah. Don't mention it on Twitter. I mean do, but maybe don't. And Vic Godard.
Yes.
So I don't have anything more to say other than to thank all the regulars that come. If you're not so regular, then please come regularly. We're doing a night on the 4th of September with A. Arcane here, which is going to be great and is selling really fast, so get involved with that if you want to. It's just a real pleasure to be hosting something for Douglas, who's such a fine author to work with, and putting this book together, even though he originally delivered 250,000 words, was genuinely a pleasure. Thank you, Douglas. Conversation will be about 45 minutes. Books for sale by our comrades Real Magic Books over there in the corner. Please buy a book. You can get it signed by Vic Godard. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much. Can we just check everyone's microphone? Douglas, are you
I'm alright.
Hello, yes.
Everyone's audible, that's lovely. The magical thing, one of the magical things about this evening that's ahead of us, the 45-minute section anyway, is that having Vic here to talk about this book is, I was trying to come up with an analogy for it, and the best one that I could really come up with was Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, where the text that is created by the ensemble Wild Stallions over many years becomes the foundation of a whole ideological system of religious belief. And
I agree with that entirely.
And basically that's what happened with Vic in Scotland, as far as I, not being Scottish, can tell, and Douglas I'm sure can perhaps illuminate whether that idea is valid or not. But the sort of the premise of this book is that we've all heard a great deal and watched a great deal on BBC4 documentaries about the Sex Pistols show at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, which everyone in Manchester subsequently claimed to have attended and started bands. But there's this sort of slightly less spangled lineage of the people that went to see Vic on the Clash tour in Edinburgh, and also I think in Glasgow, but Edinburgh's the one that the book sort of starts off with. So I suppose what we should do is ask Vic if he has any memories whatsoever of that, in general, and specifically of that gig.
Yeah, that
you
gig.
played that one.
I remember going, we had a coach driver called Norman, who was a really grumpy bastard, but he took us up to the top of Arthur's Seat before we did the gig, and we looked down on the city of Edinburgh. I don't know if anyone
Arthur's Seat is a hill.
Yeah, it's like a big volcanic thing, isn't it, that overlooks Edinburgh. And it was like being in the Roman legions for me, because I've got a wild imagination. When I was a kid, I read this book called Eagle of the Night by Rosemary Sutton.
That's an amazing book.
Yeah, where they go.
It's a shame, if we'd have known that, we could have had that for sale.
There's a pet wolf involved, isn't there? No, but anyway, it was a very foreign place. I'd come across Scots when they came down to Wembley that time, when they nicked the pitch. But this was like a new thing, actually going up into enemy territory.
And And do you have any memories of the musical section of the evening, or is it just really hard to see?
Now, the music, I don't remember anything about at all. And I thought that it would be really awful, but I've actually, someone taped it. I think it was Paul Reiki had a cassette of it, and he played it to me like years and years ago. And it was surprisingly all right.
A great Paul quote. Douglas, how did you, because you, generationally, obviously, as people can see, you're not quite as wizened as some of the rest of us, and so you weren't there, were you?
No.
You were like slightly next generation. You were hearing tales of this event perhaps later on.
Yeah, but I was kind of just under that generation, really. It was too far away. I lived away out in the countryside, so I couldn't get through to Edinburgh. But all the bands, particularly the Edinburgh bands, like the Fire Engines and Joseph Kay, they were all there. Like particularly, Davy Henderson, who went on to the Fire Engines, and a multitude of other
Very
groups.
young though, weren't they?
They were
were only
very
like
young.
15-year-olds, weren't they?
Well,
15,
16, 17, but they were, Edinburgh moved really quickly from the punk, the kind of commodified idea of punk to, Edinburgh latched onto groups like Subway Sect because it was different, and like the pop group, and like
The Slits as well.
The Slits were a massive band, for people in Edinburgh, and it was just a different take from the Identikit kind of punk thing.
I will say at this point, just because it's hopefully slightly relevant, that another reason that I'm doing this event is that I've top secretly, forwardly been at work for many years. Oh, I'm not allowed to mention it. Oh, I can. Phew. I've been working on a book with Jim and William Reed of the Jesus and Mary Chain, which will come out next year, and they are also disciples of Mr. Godard, and their experience of the Clash tour was that, and this is a world exclusive, I don't think anyone knows this, William had bought tickets off a friend at work where he had an apprenticeship at the sheet metal works, but sadly he had the tickets, but he was too scared to go because he didn't have any mates and he didn't want to go on his own, and so he missed the gig of the century as it was, which was Vic and the Clash at the Glasgow Apollo, but presumably lots of other Glasgow people were there, but he wasn't there anyway.
Yeah, there were Glasgow people that were through there, so the guys from Orange Juice were all through, and it was, it just really excited that younger generation to, and I think when they saw the Subway Sect, I think there was an element of, if they can do it, we can do it.
We were pretty awful in those days. And that was our greatest gift, the fact that we were nakedly awful and that we weren't trying to disguise who we were, and I think that was a massive thing for forming groups.
You took your naked awfulness around the country, inspiring others.
It was just like the Sex Pistols when they started off. They weren't as nakedly awful as us, but they still made a load of mistakes that you could tell, and no groups did that. They were like people like Dr. Feelgood. They never made mistakes.
You'd get killed if you made a mistake in Dr. Feelgood. You'd wake up in a canal underneath the jetty at Canvey Island, wouldn't you, if you made a mistake?
That was a big difference. So they weren't worried about being dead tight. But then when Malcolm went out and bought them a load of new equipment and record companies started getting involved, that's when the tightness crept in. And that's when I stopped taking a cassette player to tape the gigs after that moment.
It lost its magic.
It did, for me personally, yeah.
And there are quotes from quite a lot of people in the book about that gig in Edinburgh saying, Vic and the other people in the bands were just like talking to us before the gig. You were going out chatting to people.
Oh yeah, that was a new thing for punk.
Yeah.
That was like the punk way of doing things, which didn't really last long, probably, did it? Probably only lasted about 6 months, maybe.
And then you'd moved on by then, hadn't you? I mean, one of the things that the sort of the Bill and Tedness of it that fascinates me is that you did this thing that you thought was nakedly awful. Aesthetically it wasn't. It was magnificent, but you weren't thinking that because you were too innately modest. And then all these people were seeing it and being inspired by it, and you ran off in as many different directions as you possibly could, as far away from that thing that you'd done, into another musical worlds of Northern Soul and Frank Sinatra and all these other things.
It's about learning how to play, though, isn't it? You know, when you start off in punk, and you're not going via the Burt Whedon songbook. You really are grasping at 3 or 4 chords and trying to do a song based on those chords. And then when you get the hang of that and you start, I mean, I was told by people like Mickey Foot to start listening to people like Dylan so that I would get to learn more than those chords once I started playing the guitar. So it's just a natural thing that happens.
And is that what
I
you
learn.
did? So basically you got your Burt Whedon on?
Yeah. No, I didn't get my Burt Whedon on, but no, what happened was when I started playing the guitar, the group became too musical to be classed as punk. That's probably it. Yeah.
Which at some level, in commercial terms, was the ruination of you, was your musicality.
Probably just the timing of it might have been wrong.
Yeah,
we should have either done it earlier or later. The thing is, if we'd have done it earlier, we'd have been like the Stranglers, pretending to be punk when in fact you're like as good as Yes.
So at what point in your, because you fully retired from music, but you stopped playing live and stopped making records for a period of time while working in various illustrious fields, and then
stopped making music at the end of the Buzzcocks tour in 1978, November 78. That's when I first retired from live music.
Frank Sinatra.
And I didn't come back until the gig at Heaven in 1981.
Yeah.
So that was like a big gap to have just that early on. But that is when I wrote loads and loads. That's when I was like a freelance songwriter for Bernie Rhodes.
So at what point was it that you discovered that you had not an army of acolytes, because in numbers it's a select group, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very
We only have one fan, Robert Lloyd of the Nightingale of the Prefects,
but
and his girlfriend.
That's two. Don't put yourself down. That's 2 fans. But at what point later on in your odyssey did you find out? All these, because the other parallel that I think is interesting in relation to how your music, the significance that it had for this scene, is strangely the sadly recently departed American folkish musician Rodriguez, who had this massive following in South Africa that he didn't know about, who all listened to his music on bootleg cassettes, and then he could come back and do a tour there and be acclaimed as a god.
Yeah.
At what point did you go north of the border and find people laying shortbread?
No, I never did. That didn't happen until years and years
Well, that's what
later.
I mean. When
The
exactly?
first inkling I got it was someone told me that Orange Juice had covered Holiday Hymn. That was the first inklings that Sonning had sunk in, and I thought, well, how do they know that? We never played it in Scotland. It was because they'd come down to London and taped it.
And so Douglas, for you, what did your, what was your education in Vic's formative moments?
I think the Peel sessions were really great, and just the singles. It was just different from a lot of other music that was around. I think very quickly the excitement of the Sex Pistols and the Clash's first album had kind of dissipated, and if that suddenly felt quite traditional rock and roll quite quickly, whereas the Subway Sect still felt kind of other in a lot of respects.
And I mean, my theory, insofar as I have one, is that because you changed so much so quickly, that left you. You were a bit, as well as all the other things you were, there was an element of being a James Dean figure. You died pretty because you never got to make lumpy punk records, because you just had those few very early ones, and then you ran off and did everything else. And so that meant that for people that kind of cherished those records, there was a sense of a gap to be crossed of, if only you had released that album in 1978, and people, so almost as something for people like to try and build something else that they want to do.
Those Subway Sect singles, they were all quite different. If you think, Nobody's Scared, then Ambition, Stop That Girl sounded different again.
Yeah.
And then moving, Split Up the Money was a that was a big record for a lot of people, but it kind of sounded totally different from the Peel sessions, and so there was this kind of mystery about Vic up north. It just felt like, who is this guy? He's obviously he's
an enigma,
the ultimate outsider, because he just wasn't visible.
Because I couldn't hold on to a group, though. That's all it is, isn't
well,
it?
you did
all
keep
those
sacking
things.
them, didn't you? That was
I wasn't me who sacked them, but the thing is, if you've got one steady group all the time, you're going to tink around the edges. It's not going to sound as drastic as the way I went from Nobody's Scared, which was like 4 people who can, well, actually it's 3 people who can't play and 1 really good drummer. And Stop That Girl was the Black Arabs and the horn section of Dexys, so it's bound to, just having the proper musicians on it, it's going to sound totally different.
And it seems like, from listening to those records, that you felt the excitement of that rush of competence.
Oh, I did, yeah. Stop That Girl, I felt the excitement when I was actually doing the lead vocal. Just halfway through it, I thought, God, if this comes out like this, it'll be fantastic. While I was singing it.
I've got to up my game to keep up with myself. Excellent. And then from the early stages of, whether it's the Fire Engines or Joseph K, you can hear a lot of that Subway Sect thing in those bands, but you weren't probably really listening to those.
No, I've only become aware of it really in recent decades. Really.
I think the Subway Sect and the Slits and that thing of like mingling with the audience, it really made a big difference to a lot of the Edinburgh bands in particular, and they were first out the traps in terms of, Fast Product released the Mekon single in January '78, so they were really quick. And Fast Product, they kind of considered themselves a punk label really, but an intellectual punk label. Bob Last was much more interested in packaging and ideas about consumerism, and then so a lot of the ideas from those early records was to be different.
I mean,
a lot of that came from Vic and from the Slits.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about this book is, if you were going to say, what musical realm are we in, people would say, well, this is the origins of, whatever, indie rock. But then when you're thinking about Bob Last, he was someone who had quite a, I want to say toxic, but certainly prickly approach, which led him to advocate all this bands signing to majors. So you basically got this foundation stone of, as in the title, the Scottish independent pop underground movement, one half of the great holy whatever the not a trinity is when there's 2 of them.
Duopoly.
The duopoly of Bob Last and Alan Horn, who's basically telling all his bands to sign to majors.
Well, I think that was the thing with Fast was, I remember seeing something in NME, and it was by Bob Last, and he was talking about the alternative charts and independent. He said, we're not independent, we're dependent. We need the bank to give us a loan to make the records. So we're like any other record label really. And he definitely, but again, there was just
that's an extremely sophisticated analysis of...
Yeah, and it was exactly at that time that the idea of independence, was gaining a lot of currency. But he was... his viewpoint was very much, well, we're dependent, so, and he kind of dismissed it really as a notion.
And it's fascinating that as that idea of independence was being codified in a way, one of the people doing it was a die-hard advocate of basically not doing it, and also this guy who's the pillar of the Scottish independent pop underground movement started a label which was, pretty careful that its first major releases, none of them came from Scotland.
Yeah, and the first 3 bands that were on Fast Products, I'm sure you'll all know, like the Mekons, the Human League, the Gang of 4, who all sounded different. And for me, when I was a fan of the whole aesthetic of Fast Product, but when they signed the Scars, who were from Edinburgh, that
It's a great moment.
Yeah, I just suddenly thought, right, at last there's something interesting happening in Scotland. To me, that was the first great Scottish record that came out of punk.
You didn't like the Rezillos?
Well,
Diplomatic. Be diplomatic.
I'll be diplomatic. I love the Rosillos.
Are there any Rosillos here tonight?
Faye's not here, is she?
No, I've worked with Faye, so I do love the Rosillos. Oh, there you go. We both love
You've
them.
been on stage with her.
Yeah.
What did you do? What numbers
Oh,
did you
she didn't know those words. Was it the car mate, wasn't it?
Yeah, we did like when the
Sweet Jane.
Yeah. So
We
we.
didn't know what's the car they mentioned in Sweet Jane?
I know I can't remember.
A Stutz Bearcat.
That's right.
She'd
Yeah.
never heard of a Stutz Bearcat, and I said, "What? You never heard of a Stutz Bearcat?"
And nobody else knew either. It was-
No one out there's one, you can tell.
Yeah, but that was quite. I mean, that was. You know, the whole idea of the book came from a film that Grant McPhee made called Big Gold Dream, and it was it got its premiere at the Edinburgh Festival, and it won loads of awards. And afterwards, there was this after show party, and which we formed a band to play at it. So it was Vic and guys from the Fire Engines, Joseph Kay and me and some others, and we did a set of covers. And some Subway set songs.
Amazing set list on that. All my favourites.
It was brilliant. But afterwards, I was speaking to Bob Last, and he'd had a few glasses of wine, and he was being quite emotional, which is not
what he's
naturally what he's known for. And he was just saying, I cannot believe that I'm watching Vic Godard singing a Fire Engine song that I released on through on my label. So it really kind of touched a lot of people that you would think that wouldn't necessarily touch.
It's like seeing John the Baptist play with Jesus.
It's a great night, wasn't it? Really
It was
enjoyed
brilliant.
that.
It was really good
fantastic.
fun. Yeah.
One of the things that I think has been lovely about this book, now on the paperback phase of its journey, paperback's available, as Lee said, is that often when a book of this nature comes out, someone will do a couple of events, and they'll maybe do a couple of festivals, and by the time you get into the paperback, it's all maybe getting a bit weary, and people are thinking about the next book. But this one, it's kind of because you've sort of, I don't want to say curated, you designed a sort of a never-ending sequence of different things, which it's almost like there's scene that was imagined by the people that are in the book has kind of been reconstituted in ways no one could have predicted through the book. And the fact that the book came from a film kind of ties in with the sort of the multimedia interests that all these people had at that time. A lot of people, obviously we know that Vic gets his name from a certain filmmaker, and everyone was into that stuff. We're often trying to do versions of some multimedia thing or other. And the way this has worked is that the film has gone to the book, has gone to all these events, often bringing together perhaps with lifelong feuds and people with lifelong feuds and grudges that have somehow let that drop so that they can be together again, which is lovely, isn't it?
Well, I mean, you've got things like there was a really the kind of cool pub in Edinburgh was called the Tapaloris, and it was next to the art school, and you would go in there, especially as a kind of gauche rural boy, go in there and be like Fire Engines in one corner, Joseph Kay in the other, and you're like, God, don't say anything stupid, the guys are here. But back then it was, people should be prickly when they're young, and they should be, they should definitely carve out their own space.
There are a lot of elbows out there.
Sharpening their elbows, and that's as it should be. But what's been lovely about it's almost like there's a real kind of community seemed to come together through the Hungry Beat book. I mean, with the events that we've been doing, and there's been a lot of music involved with it. So we've been putting together lots of different musicians, like Malcolm Ross, who played with Joseph Kay, Aztec Camera, and Orange Juice, and lots of disparate people. Now, back in the day, they'd all have been nipping at each other, in the Tapaloris, and whereas now, everybody's in their 60s. If you're going to be if you're going to have an attitude as a pensioner, you should probably take a look at yourself. So they're really cool now. They just really enjoy doing it now, and there's none of that competitive edge.
It'd be slightly disappointing if there wasn't anyone that had kept the feuds alive. Is there anyone that you've dealt with where they've said, I'm not going in a room with them?
I'm sure there are.
Because I mean, in the original film, and I may be trespassing on difficult territory, but I don't know why. But Edwyn Collins isn't in the film, is he? And presumably there's some form of long form beef.
Isn't that to do with it's not? Didn't they go on and do a Glasgow edition part two.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that Grant was, spoke to lots of people. So basically, anyone that's not in the book, or that secondary sources have been used. It was because they didn't want to participate in the film.
Yeah.
And you've got to respect people's right to do that. You can't. I think that's absolutely valid. A lot of people don't want to look back at what they were doing 40 years ago, and they want to look to the future. So, I think that's fine.
Yeah, and I presume for you, Vic, because you so relentlessly moved into the future at the time, it's quite novel to go back.
I love looking at the past. I'm like an old nostalgia. I'm into nostalgia, and I just like the fact that people have remembered things that I haven't.
Often things you did that you can't remember.
No, I keep finding out things that I've done. Even recently, I found out, the story about Yves Saint Laurent and the Paloma Picasso with my guitar getting smashed over Johnny Green's head. I didn't know anything about that.
That's the bare bones of a pretty good story, isn't it?
I didn't find out about that until I met Johnny Green about a month ago. And I said, Johnny, what happened to my guitar that night when we did that Yves Saint Laurent? And he told me the whole story about having a bust up with Paloma Picasso's boyfriend, and when he
Barry Picasso. And what was there was one that Robert Lloyd remembered that you'd forgotten about, being in the rafters above the round.
Oh, well, I still think he's made this. I wouldn't do that.
He sometimes is a
He
stranger to the
reckons
truth.
that
it's fair
at
to
the
be said.
Rainbow, I was in the rafters flicking matches down on the Jam, trying to catch fire to their Union Jacks. I don't remember doing that.
That seems like just the kind of important political protest you would have been up for. I mean, all those unnatural fibres they were, all that polyester, they could have gone up like a human torch.
I remember my Edinburgh entrance. That was one of the best things I've ever done in my life, but also one of the most dangerous things.
What was that?
The safety curtain incident where we went on stage. It was really early we had to go on because there's quite a few groups on, and there was a big safety curtain, massive thing, and I did my normal wisdom and just held on to it and went up and up. And as I got to a sort of approaching a dangerous height, I started thinking, why the hell did you do that?
It's hard to turn back time, though, isn't it? In these
Well, the
moments.
thing is, just as I was thinking that I was really, I had the whole thing ripped in half.
Oh, so you could sail down like a parachute.
I fell down on the stage with all this thing fell on top of me. So I had a theory for years and years. I think it was only Edwin who told me that it wasn't because of that thing. I thought that was why they liked us in Scotland. Nothing to do with the music, because of that. I said to Davey, do you remember that? And he said, yeah, I do remember that, but that weren't the important thing, but it was just songs.
Oh, the songs. Oh, the songs. Douglas, because one of the other very interesting things about this book is that there's a lot of warmth about the music and about the people and about people's memories. But there's also, both Alan and Bob, who are sort of the two, in a way, there's sort of agents of change within the book, aren't they? Vic as well, obviously, but he didn't know. But they're the ones that are planning stuff and doing it. There's some quite interesting stuff they were doing, which, there was some darkness to both men, wasn't there? And they were both quite sort of very provocative, or willfully sort of winding people up, and would do stuff. And I was just wondering if you sort of seen any interesting parallels of things that have come later where you're like, well, it's not. I mean, the one that I'm thinking of with is Dominic Cummings.
After Rough Trade, and I mean the chronology is, I suppose, Fast was out there first.
Yeah.
But the people that ran these labels, if you think Bob Last, Alan, Tony Wilson, Bill Drummond, I mean, they were kind of like artists, really. They weren't like business people trying to capitalise and monetise what they were doing. So it was an unusual thing. It was definitely about art, as opposed to let's let's make a quick buck.
But there's a great bit quite early on in the book when the first Mekon single, which I think was playing on the playlist, Never Been in a Riot, was taken down to Rough Trade and sort of offered to them as being, oh, you'll like this. And
they hated it.
Jeff said it was the worst thing he'd ever heard.
But then
Bob was delighted, wasn't he? Because he was like, he thought the wrong thing about it in exactly the right way that I would have liked. So like, I, the master manipulator, made that happen. And I guess for you, Vic, the sort of the master manipulator that you dealt with was Bernie Rhodes, wasn't he? Sort of, who slightly gets remembered now as a sort of Matalan version of Malcolm McLaren, which is perhaps a bit unfair.
No, I can't see Alan Horn as a manipulator, because he's very good at disguising who he really is.
That's very manipulative.
I just couldn't find anything wrong with Alan at all.
Because he disguised himself so effectively.
But I have heard from Grace that he can do what you're talking about. But I've just never seen an example of it myself. And you always tend to, unless they do something to you.
Yeah, you've got to take them as you find them.
Yeah.
And you know, potentially because you're revered as a god north of the border, you saw the best of everyone. Because they were like, we better put on our best face in front of Vic.
Maybe.
I mean, I think, you know, with one of the things with Fast that we were talking about earlier on was, you know, how important Hilary Morrison was to the whole real movement, because she was a massive part of it as well as Bob Last. And, you know, they really became, particularly in the East Coast, it became like a really vibrant entity. So that was interesting because, you know, and Hilary ended up going on to her own band, The Flowers, you know, in front of that. But there was, I think back then, there was always the idea that you moved forward. You know, you're trying to kind of shake people's perceptions up. And, you know, I mean, as you know from the book, famously, Bob Last sold rotting orange peel, packaged it, and sold it as a concept, and people bought it. Fair enough. You know, but I think people like Tony Wilson were watching that. You know, and Tony Wilson would have admitted to Bob lots of times how influenced he was by what Fast did.
I mean, it was amazing how quick that turnaround was, and people often say, oh, you know, in the 60s, and it's true, it's amazing that the Beatles went from doing this in 63 to this in 67, but similarly, that sort of landscape of all those kind of movers and shakers, how quickly that all got started, and you know, Tony Wilson was watching someone like Bob Last and thinking, oh yeah, that's going to work, and you know, being on regional TV and whatever, and then a few months later, Factory's happening, and it's like that. It's a very tight amount of time, isn't it?
Yeah, and there was a.
Vic was in Paris fighting with Paloma Picasso.
Exactly.
So.
But I mean, very quickly it went from, you know, right, we want to get John Peel sessions, you know, so the Fast and the Postcard bands, get a John Peel session, get in the front page of the NME, and then it was like, why can't we get in the charts? And I kind of realised distribution wasn't in place to do that, so there was the idea, well, let's sign to majors, which is what they all had to do to get in the charts. You know, if you think about Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, Bluebells, all these bands, they had to sign to majors. And I mean, I think the great story.
They have to go to London, though. That's the other thing.
Well, a lot of them did.
No, that's what I'm saying. But
Yeah.
could they have stayed?
I think the idea back then was that you did move to London and you needed to, but you don't need to now because there's a good infrastructure in Scotland. But back then there wasn't, so they kind of tended to move down. But the, you know, one of the big threads running through the book is the fact that, you know, the Human League were releasing experimental music on Fast Product. And then literally 2 years later, they did a #1 single in America. And Bob Last was managing them through that whole thing. So, it's bizarre, isn't it?
It's not bad going. I don't know how we're doing for time. Do you think people would like to ask some questions? If I ask questions, will there just be an awkward silence, or will someone have some questions? Come on, someone. Has anyone got a question? There must be a question.
Oh, shy.
Shy? There absolutely no one here has any.
Ask whatever you like. Go on, please.
Question here, Ben.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, it's the bright lights. There's probably a forest of hands.
There are.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for drawing our attention to that. The gentleman lurking behind the candle there.
This is for Doug. Writing the book, were there any bands that you sort of re-listened to when you were writing and thought, that is a band that I've neglected or overlooked, and that I've really, you rediscovered certain bands?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think with in fact with some of the the label that Bob Lass did after Fast Product was Paul Porrell, and probably their shining light was like the Fire Engines, who were amazing. But some of the other records at the time, I remember thinking The Flowers, that's okay, Restricted Code, Boots for Dancing, it's okay. But when I listened to them afresh, I thought the records were absolutely amazing. So definitely that batch of groups I listened to with kind of fresh ears and thought they were really good.
Was there anyone that you had thought was tremendous, and when you went back to their music you thought,
I won't answer that one, Ben.
I'm doing my best?
That is interesting though, isn't it? The fact that, decades later, some records sound absolutely brilliant still, and some, you play them and you think, I'm not actually sure why I like that.
Sometimes I think also it's to do with whether someone's like, a lot of people have followed that person, so like if there's a lot of things that you're used to hearing that were based on something, sometimes when you hear the thing it was based on, you're like, well, it's not all that, because I've heard all that other stuff that's like it.
Yeah, I mean, we did a book event at the Edinburgh Book Festival on Saturday night, and after it was Hilary Morrison and Paul Research from the Scars and me and Grant, and after the chat we did there was a live set, but it was largely Boots for Dancing with a few other people involved, and they were playing for want of a better term, punk funk, so did a pop group song, a contortion song, Discord by the Fire Engines, and it just sounded amazing. On some of these records, like Boots for Dancing in particular, the eponymous single, just listening to that again, it really was pretty amazing, but they kind of didn't cut through in the same way as the bands like the Fire Engines. The Fire Engines got their place, because immediately people responded, but some of those other bands on Paul Porrell just didn't cut through for whatever reason.
And how does Grant, who made the film, who I think is a little younger, isn't he? So
yeah.
It's not sort of his era. What first drew him to this period?
I think because he was a Joy Division fan, and he suddenly found out that Joy Division had released a track or two tracks on one of the Fast Product projects, Earcom, and then I think he met Malcolm Ross. He did some interviews, but it was largely about Fast, and Malcolm started telling about all these other bands. So, because I think the Postcard story is quite well known to an extent, but the Fast Product story wasn't. So Grant just really started digging into that, and that's how I met him. He interviewed me because I was in the band Article 58, which we toured with Joseph Kay and did a record with Malcolm Ross, and so he started piecing it all together. He's a great documentary maker, and it was an interesting seeing it from a much younger person's perspective, and that was where he kind of came into it, and no preconceived ideas or notions.
That probably helped, didn't it? Because he wasn't going into with an agenda of something that he wanted to demonstrate.
Yeah, and that's why I think the documentary was great. And he had so much, he had a massive archive of interviews that, obviously if you're doing a documentary, you can only use a snippet here and there. So that's, you had a chat with him and decided to take on the notion of doing the, kind of oral history of it. And that's what resulted in the book, I suppose.
And it's funny how you get, it is presented very much as an oral history, and you have those people like the chorus, and then obviously that's their probably, perhaps they've thought about it quite a lot, and it's their view of what happened, and then you've sort of picked that history up and moved it on a bit, because now they'll be appearing in bands at Hungry Beat events, playing the carefully curated selections of punk funk classics.
Yeah, but it's
nice to get them out of the house.
It gets them out of the house. None of them really do music anymore, so it's a lot of them don't, and it feels it's all done in the right spirit,
Yeah, it's lovely. Any more questions out there? There must be one. Mark, you must have a question. Oh, there's one. Old Mr. Perry, he'll have a question.
Do Mark first.
No, he hasn't got one. He's just playing his phone.
I can come up with a question anytime. Douglas, in the year that the book's been out, have you looked at any reviews, and are there any that have chimed and made you think, yeah, that's exactly what I trying to get across? And is there a converse to that? Is there anything that you thought you're a dickhead by yourself?
He's so diplomatic. He's not going to say.
Yeah, I'm going to be really bland and diplomatic. There was a really good.
We're amongst friends.
Yeah, there was a really good review. In fact, most of the reviews have been really good actually. So,
Well, even when you got slated in the Daily Mail.
yeah, no, they've all been pretty good. So it's been fine, you know. And Keith Cameron had a really perceptive review in Mojo. But again, Keith was in Scotland,
Does that
and
mean 3 stars?
yeah, 3 out of 5.
That's the least number of stars
3
you're
out of
allowed
3.
to give in Mojo. You can't give 2 or 1. You can give 3. That is the minimum. So if you see someone give something 3 stars in Mojo, that means that they think it's massively flawed.
I got more than 3.
I should hope so too. Andrew, a man who's given many a 3-star review in his time.
3, it's a kicking.
Yeah, it's brutal, isn't it? And
Just to translate for those who
it's funny because it's just absolutely ridiculous that you're not like. It would be so much more interesting if you could go from 1 to 5.
Yeah.
But there's so much understandable anxiety about the future of music magazines as artifacts
And advertising.
that they think we'll lose advertising and we can't allow the readers to think there's something we're not really enthusiastic about. So the mentality is we only put things in this magazine that we think are worth at least 3 stars, which is obviously nonsense because you're putting stuff in that's got to be in there and you might hate it. So, you know, connoisseurs of these things, you can read a sort of very carefully modulated 3-star review, which is actually more devastating and damning than the most terrible kicking administered by someone with 1 star that, you know, when you were allowed to do that kind of thing. Anyway, just a little sidebar there. Andrew,
a little secret club.
Yeah, what's
into like veiled kickings.
Yeah.
It's the same as loving Vic.
Yeah.
But this is a question for Vic actually. We're almost talking about Bernie Rhodes there, but it was sort of conversation.
Bernard.
Yeah. Was he a good thing? Did he in any way kind of withhold the Subway set from?
Well, he withheld our first album, didn't he? So
Yeah.
that would have launched us into immediate superstar.
There are some great tunes on that.
Was there not a flood involved as well with the first album?
Yeah. No, the thing is, I mean, he was still good, even though he did that. He just wasn't a very good manager. But he was really good, just not a rock management.
That is, to be fair, that is what he was doing.
Yeah, I know, that's what was unfortunate about it. What I'm saying is,
That's why I say this guy that ruined my bathroom, he's really good at playing chess, but he's a shit player.
No, but the thing is, like someone like me, I just learned 3 chords, and if he hadn't sort of told Mickey Foot, gotta sort him out, tell him how to write songs, you know, I wouldn't have met anyone that knew that Bob Dylan had interesting chords if it wasn't for Bernard. So, and I wouldn't have met anyone that knew how to plug in an amp even, or anything like that. So it's a matter of
Swings and roundabouts.
well, no, I
Makes
think
it
massively more positive than negative.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunate that he was crap as a management guru.
Yeah.
I mean, if it
Which is what he was doing.
but I think anyone can do that. No, not anyone, but it's harder to be a Bernard Rhodes than it is to be a good rock manager. Don't you reckon?
That's a very humane approach. You know, if you're willing to take that approach, then
I mean, I've never met an actual rock manager saying that, though. I mean, I've met Malcolm McLaren and Bernard Rhodes, but I wouldn't call it, they're not your normal sort of solid rock management style.
Have you not
are
met
they?
any sort of more ploddy guys that have said,
No,
"Look, Vic, I
I've
can
never
take
met-
you in hand and get you gigs in West
Robert
London."
Lloyd thinks he's my manager, but that's the nearest I've got, you know.
He takes you horse racing. And
No, not that. He just advises me against doing things. But he doesn't think he just says, if I was your boss, I would do this, Vic.
what kind of things does
Well,
he tell
sing
you
in
not to
French.
do?
Don't
sing in French.
sing in French. That's right.
In a post-Brexit world, it's just a non-starter. No one wants that sophisticated stuff you do. Well, excellent question. Any more where that came from? We might be nearly done.
What was the question? I forgot what it was. I don't even know if I answered it.
It was about Bernie Rhodes.
Oh yeah, definitely more positive than negative. That's the answer to
Not
that one.
free stuff.
Yeah.
Question there, I think.
Man in the hat.
Thank you. Question for Douglas, really. I just wonder, post 1984, and what happened in Scotland?
Well, probably.
The other, like,
Deacon Blue.
Through to 86 and so on.
Yeah, I think.
Wonder what you thought of that.
I think what happened there was all the bands got really smart in terms of how to get record deals. I personally don't think the music was quite as good, but everybody got really sussed. And it did get, I mean, Scotland, once all the major record companies started coming up, if you were wearing a tartan shirt and you had a quiff and a semi-acoustic guitar, there's $100,000, you know. So there was like that thing where everybody got record deals, but it wasn't quite as inspired, and it was kind of major record stuff, major label stuff, really.
Seems a bit unfair that didn't happen to Vic.
Or me.
Just wrong timing.
What about the bands like the Pastels though, and they were sort of quite influenced by that.
Yeah.
They're very uber indie.
Well, there was probably, you know, like the Pastels and bands that I suppose are now called C86 groups. There was that sort of. It kind of felt, although Stephen's the same age as me, it felt like they were kind of younger brothers in the way they came after that. But they were brilliant.
They sort of kept the flame alive.
Absolutely, yeah.
After the rapacious music industry came up and gave deals to lots of people that possibly shouldn't have had them.
Yeah.
Then there were people thinking, oh, we're going to take it back to basics and, you know, do something that...
Yeah, and the Pastels have been amazing from day one, and they still are. You know, Stephen's really, really involved in the community up there. Encouraging people, but then you had the bands through in Edinburgh, like, you know, like Shop Assistants and, you know, Jesse Garrow and Fizz Bomb. So there was a whole bunch of stuff that kind of kept coming through, and then of course you've got the, you know, the Mary Chain, Jesus and Mary Chain, they came along, and it just felt like there was a lineage that kind of developed.
I mean, one of the interesting things that Mary Chain said about that was that when they and Primal Scream were trying to get started in Glasgow, that they absolutely couldn't get arrested, couldn't get a gig, couldn't get anyone to even listen to their demo tapes, because everyone had decided that they'd moved on from this and Postcard, and it was all about that sort of love hip sway and love of money, and it was all that sort of very mid-80s cod soul stuff.
Yeah. It was kind of like I think Bobby Gillespie said, like, everybody was influenced by Young Americans, which we all were actually, you know, massively.
It was David Bowie's fault.
It's Bowie. But the, I mean, I think, like, you know, undoubtedly Jesus and Mary Chain had to come down to London to make it happen, just because the environment had changed. And
yeah, they were seen as a sort of weird throwback in Glasgow. It was like they were trying to turn back the clock to be like the Fire Engines in a weird way.
I guess. But, you know, then you've got that thing when you know, they found an environment down here, and obviously Alan McGee had started putting out the Creation stuff, so that worked perfectly. But it was almost like a sort of Republic of Scotland had invaded London, just like Wembley.
William Reid had a very funny story that he tried to go to that game, and he was very drunk with his mate, and they tried to get. They decided to hitchhike on the Friday night before the Saturday for the game down at Wembley in 1977, and they unfortunately they calculated like how many miles it was. It was like, we get all these lifts. And the first person they got in a car with was a complete psychopath who sort of drove a wall at 100 miles an hour. He escaped the car, ran away, and ended up in Kilmarnock, which even I know is not near Wembley. And then they got home in time to see the BBC sports commentators saying, you know, these Scottish people are animals. Look, you know,
swinging on the crossbar.
Yeah, swinging on the crossbar, and it's like William's going, it's only a piece of fucking wood. We're not throwing bottles at a family restaurant in Brussels. Anyway, are there any more questions? Well, there is one more at front there.
What's Bob Ross doing now? Is he into music or?
No, Bob stopped doing music quite quickly. I mean, after the Fast Product period, he managed bands like the Human League, were on a major, Heaven 17, And he had a management company that did ABC when they had, you know, their massive big first album with Trevor Horn. He managed Scritti Politti. So he kind of took those bands that seemed like they were kind of, for want of a better term, rough trade type bands, but they wanted to infiltrate the mainstream. And he was the perfect manager to do that, because he could sit in the boardrooms of the multinationals and talk them into giving them lots of money in marketing and promotion. But after that, he got into film. I think he'd had enough of pandering to musicians as a manager.
Is that why he wouldn't let the Scars license Morrissey?
I'm not sure why that was. He has a very distinct relationship with
He's an interesting bunch of people, isn't he?
Yeah, but you know, he's a good guy, I think, ultimately. You know, a lot of the people though, like the Scars and some other people that over time have wanted to license their own material. When we did an event in Edinburgh about a year ago, and that Bob was interviewed for that, and every single one of the musicians was in the dressing room, and it was like, you know, them greeting a long lost brother. There was a lot of love to him, even though they'd obviously had business disagreements over the years. So he's well fondly remembered, I think, by all these people.
I mean, when you consider that achievement of coming up with the sort of very highly conceptualised and slightly, potentially slightly winging it, Fast Product thing, and then actually taking that to having #1 albums in America in a couple of years. It's amazing that he's not a bigger, someone that you hear more about, isn't he? I mean, you couldn't really hear much more about Tony Wilson, who did make a big contribution. But if you look at actually the bands that Bob Last, the musical legacy of Bob Last would probably come out pretty well in a fight for the musical legacy of Tony Wilson.
Yeah, you've got these things like, Bob growing up was a massive fan of Miles Davis, before punk, and then suddenly, you've got Scritti Politti having a hit single in America, and Miles Davis is playing on the Scritti Politti album and covering Perfect Way, I think it was. I mean, that's kind of bizarre in many respects.
Yeah, and absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And I think perhaps his sort of, the particular nature of his prickliness, which sort of comes through in the book, not in an aggressive way, but there's a sort of an edge to it. But it's not a kind of easily mythologized edge like the McLaren edge or also the Bernie Rhodes edge. It's like, it's not something that you're necessarily drawn to. In the text, you get a sense of what it's like, but you're not thinking, I wish I knew this guy. It's quite sort of cold.
Yeah, I think that's probably, that's a good point. And I think that he moved so quickly out of music, once he'd reached those kind of having #1 albums in America, with the Human League, etc., and moved into film, it was almost like, well, that's the past.
Yeah.
And he's been very gracious doing the Hungry Beat events, because if you think about it, it's quite weird looking back 40 years at something you've got nothing, you don't do anything remotely related to it anymore. And so yeah, it's been quite strange for him, I think, but he's been a great participant in the Hungry Beat event so far.
Excellent. Is there one more question? There is. Lady in front.
Yeah, it's for Douglas, really. I was lucky enough to be at an event you hosted it in Glasgow for at the CCA.
Oh yeah.
And
was that much better than this one?
And it was well, it was more of a gig really. So there was a kind of constance of supergroup, basically, of people participating from all the bands that have been involved.
We can't compete with that.
And Douglas didn't leave the stage. He was playing guitar with absolutely every one of them. Yeah. So it was quite a feat. But obviously, quite a lot of people there hadn't performed for maybe quite a while. Do you think it made them reevaluate the impact they'd had on the kind of music in Scotland and beyond, particularly for those who hadn't continued with music, who were still performing today? And do you think it meant something to them?
It meant an awful lot. It was quite emotional for them, because a lot of the musicians don't do music anymore. So it was great. You had, Davy Henderson was doing a Wind song, which he always vowed he would never do again, and but kind of reevaluating the past and just going, well, let's just do it. And what I thought was nice about it, because we had Faye Fife doing a couple of Rosillo's songs as well, proving that I am a fan of the Rosillos. And and just various people that were involved. But what was nice was just having with the Pastels and Norman from Teenage Fan Club, and Norman went to all the gigs I went to, like going to see Orange Juice at the Bungalow and what have you. So yeah, it was a really beautiful night. That actually, it was amazing, and I think all the musicians really can't believe that there's still an interest in what they did 40 years ago.
Yeah. No, it was great nights. Thanks for that.
Good.
Do you think there's an element of not quite therapy, but healing / closure for people to come out and probably had feelings about what they've not done all those years that they would have enjoyed potentially doing if they carried on?
Yeah, I think there probably was. I think a lot of people it kind of allowed them to move forward.
I just want to ask you a question. Between Edinburgh and Glasgow, what was do you know much of the scene in Glasgow, or was it a totally different scene, or was it, what was going on in Glasgow, or do you not know?
Well, the thing that really happened in Glasgow was Postcard, which was amazing.
Music seemed always to be not quite as harsh as Edinburgh. Why is that?
Well, the common analogy that's made is like Edinburgh is like New York, kind of like No Wave, the Voidoids, television, and Glasgow's more like looking back to the birds and love and melodic.
Why did that happen though?
I don't know. Well, see, there's always a big country and western thing in the West, and I don't know if that's part of it.
What about the Skids? I mean,
they were from Dunfermline, and they, obviously they kind of happened before all this stuff. Really, they were probably the first punk group that got onto a major label and had success. So you had bands like that in the Simple Minds, but they were obviously different from what was happening with Fast Product and Postcard.
The funny thing is, if you talk to someone from Glasgow about people from Edinburgh, they'll always say, "Oh, those Edinburgh guys are just much more hard-edged," aren't they?
Well, depends who you're talking about.
I'd say posher.
Well, I don't think the Fire Engines are very posh. No, I mean, it was really, like anywhere, it's quite polarised. Obviously Edinburgh's perceived as a middle-class city, and that's true. There's loads of schemes in Edinburgh as well, and the Fire Engines are all from a scheme, Clarmiston, and it's amazing. They're all still really best pals, but they all kind of grew up there.
I don't know if they know what a scheme is.
A scheme is an estate, would that be? Yeah, an estate.
I think one of the
when I
beauties
first
of it
met
was,
David.
Sorry.
Go on.
Because I'm from Glasgow, but I was at uni in Edinburgh, so I was going to all the gigs in Edinburgh at this time, so I was an unusual crossover, because there's quite often a bit of rivalry between the two cities. But a lot of those gigs were happening in both cities, obviously, and people would go to see the Postcard bands in Edinburgh as well as in Glasgow, and vice versa. So I think there was, whereas yes, there's a definite difference to the music. I think people who were interested in the music at that time were embracing both elements, because it was just such an excitement at the time that music was coming out of Scotland, be it Glasgow or Edinburgh, and you could actually embrace and enjoy both.
There's a funny thing. Jim Reed said that the thing that most impressed him about the Slits was that Hurry Up urinated on the stage.
That's right. Yeah.
And he said, I just saw that and I thought, that's amazing. Imagine if I could see that one day. And he thought, hang on a minute, no one wants to watch me urinate on stage.
Something to definitely look towards there.
Vic, you've never urinated on the stage?
I have.
Oh, have you?
I have.
She got the idea from you.
No, she didn't, because I did it when I was in my crooner phase.
Because I mean, Dean Martin, it was like Dean Martin.
We were really sort of, although we had tuxedos on, that was when we had the real sort of punk rebellious thing going on. Because when I was in the punk era, we were like shy, retiring and meek. We didn't do the going around smashing things up. That only started when I put on the old bow tie
you
and
like
tuxedo.
The Rat Pack?
Yeah.
You were like Dean Martin.
It must have been the whiskey.
I don't think we can do better as a finishing point than Vic in a dinner jacket urinating on the stage.
Yeah, but I didn't do it in full view of everyone. I was discreet. I went behind the drum kit and did it into a bottle.
I can't add anything to that. Thank you very much, everyone, for being a great audience. Thank you very much to Douglas and Vic. Thank you. Thank you. Books are available, and I'm sure they'll be willing to mingle with the crowd in proper punk fashion.